I got home to a quiet house. My guess was that, other than Fauve, the whole family was plastered. I did have the sense to wonder if my people made it back to the embassy quarters safely, but I was reasonably sure that they did, though they would have to send people to go fetch the cars. My steps were staggered, and I was busy vowing never to drink again, while Byron and Bosun helped me get down the steps, over to my room, and let me flop down into bed. I don't know what time it was when we got back, so I have no idea how long I slept. However, before I fell asleep, I made a few mental notes that I put together later. Human death rituals are not about the dead, but the living, and the disposition of goods after death is dual purpose. First, it properly dispenses goods that enriches those the deceased cared for, but also it provides memorial touchstones. Where most intelligent races have a fairly dismissive view of the dead, the human sense of empathy is so highly developed that it is fair to say it is overdeveloped. They recall the dead with the same sense of affection and love as if the person were still with them. A parent who loses a child might cling to the child's toys for years, and if they do finally give them up, it will be to another child who will appreciate them in the same way. When a comrade passes, a treasured object gains almost religious reverence, a thing bonding the living and the dead across even an impossible divide. As I see it, part of Percival's motivation in assisting Fauve was not just the repayment of a debt. He bonded with her in mere hours. His steady guidance was frankly grandfatherly. More about the role of elderly in human society later, and based on the limited descriptions Byron would later give regarding Percival's son and daughter-in-law, I think Fauve reminded him of them. By the same token, Percival's post-death generosity with Byron seemed to be a kind of transference. As humans have the unique ability among intelligent species to find families, a transferal of affection is far from impossible. This is especially true if the recipient of that transference did something remarkable on the giver's behalf, or on behalf of someone important to the giver. The complex weaving of bonds between humans is fascinating to no end, and I could not help but notice that it was strongly rooted in their psychological need to connect. Even those who lack the ability to connect still have a need to do so. Overcoming this difficulty in empathetic connection has been the work of generations of human scientists who have tried everything from drug therapy to animal therapy to draw the inner human out of their shell. Assisting others with their desire to connect, either connecting with them in person or simply providing mentorship, guidance, and patience, is considered a noble service to society. In studying my host family, my humans, I must point out that the two children are given abundant attention. William and Rebecca regularly sit down to have coffee with Fauve and simply talk with her. Eye contact and light physical contact are common. A hug, holding her hand, a fist bump, a kiss to her forehead. Affection is myriad in its expression, and I have not listed them all here. But all seem centered around ensuring she is confident in her familial support, safe, and learns how to behave with others. The result of all this was a girl who seemed nearly fearless when speaking to a room full of adults, many of whom wanted to just use her for their own agendas. Michael, being so very young, received very different attention. He was held often, cuddled, most affection was physical, and there were various simple games. Smiles were common. Nonverbal communication in humans is important. This is not unique to humans, as Dlamisa have a number of physical tells regarding our moods, ear motions, tail motions and positions, and the baring of teeth. But in humans, the lack of these nonverbal communications is detrimental. Smiling is instinctive and meant to spark a reciprocal expression in the adult. Withholding it in the long term will actually damage the development of the child. Michael, it seemed, was in no danger of that. Their games centered around smiles, snuggles, and simple rhyming songs that, with a little reworking, would have served as suitable rhythms for drinking songs. If I'm to make a full confession, I was typing this in bed. Hangovers are unpleasant. If by unpleasant you mean that it feels as if an asteroid impact has struck your head, only you can't die, so it just throbs and throbs without end. I spent most of the day just lying there typing this out and trying to recall more details from the most recent events. I stopped only to get the story that I could from Byron and Boatswain, independently of course. Thankfully, they were kind enough to bring me a small breakfast, which included a note from Fauve wishing me well. I thought it was because she was going to work at her usual job at the mall candy shop that she hadn't come by to see me that morning. But William informed me otherwise when he came down a short while later with the traditional post-hangover coffee. She's at their headquarters. That was where she went last night, Teresa took her back to fill out some legal forms," he said while mixing cream and sugar until I nodded when it was enough. He stirred the blend with more vigor than he really needed to, so much so that when he stopped stirring, the spoon kept sliding around the inner rim of my cup for a full rotation before it finally stopped. He set the cup down beside my bed, and I sat up. My ears were all pricked up. William wasn't exactly a genius at deception, but even if he had been, my sense of smell knew anxiety pheromones at this point. "Isn't that good?" I asked. I genuinely didn't know one way or the other if it was, but if it wasn't, I wanted to understand why. "I remember things before the drinking, and she got a lot of credits. Her future is set, right? A job, a fortune, what's to worry about?" William rolled his eyes and sat down in the nearby chair. He drummed his fingers on the table and said, "I don't know. I guess it's weird thinking of her actually growing up. She's going to be 15 in a few months. A few years from that, she'll be a legal adult. I guess that just threw me off a little." He gave me an almost playful little half smile and ran his hand through his hair. "Silly stuff. Don't think about it. Thinking probably hurts still anyway. I didn't know you could drink that much." It was a change of subject. I knew it. Though I don't know if he knew I knew it. But I allowed it. I touched my left hand to the side of my head, and after taking another sip of coffee and setting the cup down, I dramatically flopped out on the bed. "If you could kill me now, that would be great." I flopped one arm over my eyes and made the most melodramatic sigh I could, imitating a human drama show. And it had the desired effect. William laughed. I enjoyed cheering up my humans, and I could feel his anxiety levels decline a little. But it wasn't over. "I got a data note from your embassy," William said, and I removed my arm from over my eyes. In my mind, that could not be a good thing. Deportation. I thought right away. It wasn't always at the forefront of my mind, but it was still a going concern. Thankfully, Wolfbeard at least had his father's stubbornness and kept making motions before the court, and thanks to the human right to face their accuser, I had to remain on Earth for any potential trial. If I left, there was always the chance he'd be freed, or that Fauve would be forced to face him again. Nobody wanted that. Percival's thoroughness in his media blitz was such that nobody wanted to be the politician behind Wolfbeard's release. Coupled with Byron's explanation of Percival's personality and special hatred for xenophobes, it is just further testament to one singular truth. Do not poke humans, especially their families. Their overdeveloped capacity to empathy has a converse overdeveloped capacity for unbridled revenge. As it happened, however, William's news wasn't nearly that bad. "Apparently you had quite an evening last night, and your embassy was very pleased with your—" He paused, cleared his throat, and made the most exaggeratedly formal tone he could, saying to me, "Hard work in developing interspecies relations between Dlamacens and humans. As such, you are to be rewarded." "Rewarded?" I asked, and William nodded. "I was CC'd on the message, but it was you it was sent to. Apparently something involving a sport called ballyball, but it lacks details on that. You can read it yourself, but the long and the short of it is that a Dlamacen freighter has been redirected, and it is on its way to Earth to buy a lot of alcohol, and as a citizen of their world, you're supposed to help them select the best options. If you do, they're sponsoring you for a work and education visa in addition to your exchange visa." "They're what?" I asked, but I was already racing through my datapad for information. I found the message and read through it. "So, I can attend a human university, study student life, and I can get an actual job?" "Yes, as long as you help them with the alcohol shipment." William explained. "They've asked that as a friendly human, I facilitate your employment and admittance, basically get you a job and get you enrolled." It was Dlamacen through and through, hardly subtle, very direct. You do this and this will be what you get for it. Very straightforward, and then it was done, but it was too good of an opportunity to pass up. "Yes, of course, and, did you by chance hear from—" "Yes, they'll be at dinner tonight. You might want to get cleaned up and for God's sake, take a shower, you smell like—" I knew the smile he made. He was going to use one. I braced myself. A booze hound. I groaned at yet another dad joke, and he rose to his feet. "I'll get right on it," I promised him when he reached for the doorknob. He turned the brass knob and the catch opened with a click, but before he exited, he looked back at me and said, "I know. I've already arranged for a job interview and reached out to the admissions department for the University of Louisville. See you upstairs," he said, and left me behind. As I tried to rise, I reached for the half-empty cup and took another long drink to polish off the remnants of the rich cream-colored coffee and thought, maybe he's getting better at reading me than I believed. There is a strangeness to the human work ethos. On the left hand of the scale, they can be so lazy that it's a wonder they don't grow moss. Multiple vacations, creature comforts. Far be it for me to complain about these, since I would have to ruin my academic integrity by pretending I didn't very much enjoy them. But on the right hand of the scale, they are capable of tremendous energy and ambition, a desire to leave their mark on the world and achieve something they deem worthy of themselves. Even for so non-homogeneous a species, these extremes in them were jarring. I adapted better, I think, than most of my fellow students, in part because Dlamacans have at least some of these traits encouraged by our culture. Strangely enough, with humans at least, it is the lazy that make the largest difference. This may shock some of the more industrious races who read what I am about to write, but I will explain. Picture an industrious idiot tasked to bring 100 clay vases across a very wide room. Because he is industrious, he is willing to work hard, but because he is an idiot, his solution is to carry a great many of them, and as a result, he drops them, and they shatter. Now picture an intelligent and industrious person. They work out what they can carry, and tirelessly make many trips, ensuring each one in safety, breaking very few, and he finishes after a very long time. Now picture a lazy idiot. He does nothing. And lastly, a clever but lazy one. This one makes a cart with wheels and takes them all across with minimal effort. All of human civilization has advanced because somebody set out to make things easier to do. Whether inventing irrigation because buckets took too long, or pulleys because heavy things are troublesome, humans are the only species I have ever encountered that can turn laziness into a superpower. Which is why I was thinking hard about my next job while I got up and went to the shower downstairs that I would use to clean myself off. Humans, even more than Dlamisa, love their water. Perhaps because so much of the planet is covered with it, they think it normal. My homeworld has substantially less, but it is because of that we're drawn to it. Unlike Earth, my home is a megacontinent, our own Pangea. The first of our kind to travel around it did so on foot. But the human divisions brought about by having not 1 or 2, but 7 continents, made exploration far more dangerous, and their superabundance of water gave them far more options than they had any business having. With the abundance of massive seas providing nearly unlimited food for generations, their civilizations were able to grow up independently of one another. But I digress. I find myself doing that more lately, the longer I am here. My shower, yes, as I said, I had my own which provided ample hot water, though I am somewhat embarrassed to admit that I, as Fauve put it, smell like wet dog. Rebecca helped to compensate for this by setting up 3 standing fans connected to a single power strip, along with a few extra towels, so that when I left the shower, I could simply turn on the fans while trying to dry myself. It took some time, and I had to go from standing to kneeling to turning around for several minutes at a time. But it is a bad guest who stinks up the home of his host. I'm reticent to add this part before detailing the events of dinner. However, after the publication of the 2nd edition of this volume, certain homophobic species let their fear of Homo sapiens get the better of them, and it was whispered that I was forced by the Walker family into an elaborate cleaning ritual as a way of humiliating me, or because they considered aliens to be filthy. Therefore, I add into this edition my refutation of that claim. Dlamacan fur may range from thick to short, but mine was on the thicker side and relatively long. As such, when taking showers, I would get thoroughly drenched and drip water for hours if not properly dried. Aside from puddles around the house that could be slipped on, I admit the odor was not the best. Therefore, I was more than happy to meet them halfway, and if it took a little longer to start my day, what of it? Unlike humans, I didn't have to engage in the same daily cleansing ritual, only weekly. More if I dirtied myself at the park. So with that interval accounted for, and that rumor refuted in my own hand, I returned to the narrative. After throwing on a pair of shorts and a loose t-shirt, I headed for the stairs. Before I got there, I could already hear 2 familiar voices. One, my avian comrade, Kawik. He was an odd one, as I recall. Not many Kitsians became linguists, and he was another of the few predatory races to evolve, making him a double oddity. He was living with Virginia Walker and her son Samuel, who were paired with him because of all the Walker clan. They were the most mobile, and Kitsians do not idle well in one place for more than a few weeks at a time. Their world is unique in that their civilization did not begin on land, but in the sky. Their ancestors settled on large floating fungi that drifted over their world. From what I know, they went down to land to create short-term harvesting sites and began rotational work that let their people make more discoveries, and so it went. Despite being settled and civilized, they are still known as wanderers. Kawik was very much one of his people, with a sharp-hooked beak and a somewhat bulging red-feathered throat. He had no claws on his hands, but rather 9 webbed digits with small spines that would punch through whatever he grabbed. His more predatory ancestors slew their prey by grabbing it out of the air, then crushing it by slamming it into the ground below. As predatory species went, they were the Dlamisa of the air. The other voice I heard was that of Professor Schlith. I stopped, resting my hand on the rail and remaining out of view on the stairs. My student seems to have embroiled you in a thorough mess, and I would like to apologize for any fault of his. I should add that Tlaxishi do not really have a concept of apology in their culture. Among their people, anyone who does something offensive removes themselves immediately for a period of 30 days, time enough for aggression hormones to dissipate. Much of their communication age came about expressly because they needed to do more work at a distance and couldn't afford to not communicate for an Earth month or nothing would ever get done. Since his sojourn to Earth, the concept of an expression of verbal regret has entered their lexicon, and between that and some medicinal hormone blockers that make them less defensive, they are a more peaceful species than before. There is a reason Schlith became famous in academic circles for his work with humans, but at the same time, it seems he was not immune from being impacted by his own studies. His apology flowed so naturally from him that had I not known his voice and heard the faint flick of his tongue darting up to his eyeball, I might have thought it was a human speaking. Come now, Professor. You know how these things go. At least it certainly does with Virginia and her mate. I could practically see Kawik's feathers puff out. I knew little about his time with Virginia, but what little I knew was that she and her mate were prone to various hijinks and exotic travel, throwing themselves headlong into every new experience. It wasn't hard to conclude that he'd come to think of humans as headstrong and relentlessly adventurous, not to mention prone to getting into trouble. Think nothing of it. Maybe there was a better way, but you don't always have time for the better option, and I'll be damned if it wasn't fitting. Besides, Grandfather told me you learned that we do just fine with disruption. William's laugh after the last word was as thick and rich as syrup on pancakes, and it was at that moment that I realized that while I'd come to learn a fair bit about his immediate household, I didn't know a lot about his family history. I should have read the unabridged version, not Professor Sixlith's purely academic work. That, if the reader is interested, is when I decided to release my volumes of thesis work as a journal instead of a traditional observatory report, breaking with centuries of tradition and presenting a narrative instead. The academic tome contained premises, conclusions, and evidentiary observations abound, but the meat or the humanity of the work was absent. It presented an incomplete picture that left me less prepared than I might have otherwise been for my time on Earth. As I reached the main floor, I saw an unexpected sight. Blorup, my semi-permeable colleague, who I recalled moved like an oversized slug and was at least once or twice turned into a puddle from alcohol, had taken a human shape. It wasn't quite perfect, but he had clearly learned to morph his body into something two-legged, though the proportions were a little off. But it was good enough that he wore a kind of clothing. More specifically, he was wearing galoshes and a bright yellow raincoat that had been clearly cut and re-sewn into shorts and a button-down shirt, or something like it. You never know what to expect, so you can't plan for everything, he said, and to me, that was a shock. Blorup came from a very conservative race called Baxili. Baxilians are even longer lived than Dlamisa, reproduce asexually, and their offspring retain a large percentage of their parental memories. While they are a predatory race, they are also capable of living off of almost anything, even more than humans, as they can survive off of a diet of raw minerals. That is to say, they can eat rocks. I would have been less surprised to hear William offer rocks for dinner than I was to hear a Baxili say that you can't plan for everything. Of course, with humans, that was simply the truth. Professor, Blorup, Kawik, good to see you. I extended my hand in a human greeting, and my professor's lips twitched a little when I made the very human gesture, and it was met by my classmates. We shook hands one by one, Kawik being careful not to do any accidental stabbings. I kept a brave face on it, but I knew what it had to be about. "Come, sit," Rebecca said, and went to the coffee maker. As Michael wasn't in his chair, I had to assume he was down for a nap, but though she put a brave face on it, I noticed the way her hands trembled a little and how she focused more intently on the task of coffee making than she usually did. Any doubts I had about the subject were erased. William emphasized his wife's words and gestured toward several chairs, his hand falling to the wooden back of one of them when his eyes met mine. I went for it, while the others went for empty chairs of their own. Professor Schlith waited until the steam was rising from each of our cups and the cream was flowing out of its container. We all took one long, deep breath, inhaling the fragrant aroma of the rich liquid that so shaped much of human culture. Only then, when each of us had a hand on our cups and Rebecca claimed a seat of her own, did my professor speak. "We need to talk about Bailey's stay and how much longer it will be, or rather, not be.